in fact, we should start this roundtable by mapping what we want to talk about. We want to talk about compliance, maybe. We want to talk about governance and contribution. We want to talk about quality and security. And we may, if we have time, talk about, say, the architecture, where, if there is any sweet spots. So you represent here the industry. You represent the big companies, and you illustrate our theme towards industry maturity. And this afternoon we'll have more other companies. So the first question would be, seems to compliance from your perspective, guys, seems to be, and I mean, I'm not talking about standards. I don't want to talk about standards. I don't want to have standards in the picture here. But compliance seems to be the entry point through which you started being engaged with open source, because it seemed all a bit risky, and you really had to be very careful. Is that so? How is it evolving? You said compliance is very easy, but you said also that compliance is easy on the paper and maybe not exactly. So can you please elaborate a little bit on this?
Maybe I can start, because I watched evolution of these companies here with such great guests for over 20 years, from being, extremely skeptical, if not understanding, to being fully supportive. And even last, let's say, 5 years was a huge change from being lost and scared about various licensing models to amazing speech today about, for example, AGPL consequences and how it impacts the software development and contribution and using open source, being fully aware of the constraints and managing it in corporate processes. So I really admire the change that was that happened over recent years. That I believe that now those huge organizations can really be compliant and aware of that compliance.
I probably add to this a little bit. In my opinion, compliance is really still a very time-consuming task, much more time-consuming than it should be.
Huge activity.
Yes.
Agreed.
And what's also still a white spot, in my opinion, is that the compliance tools are not really integrated into the DevOps tool chain. Yeah? So my dream is to have at least a build target which says for a product make SPDX or something like that, and then having all the compliance artifacts generated automatically. The problem is that let's say, variety of expressing licenses is so huge that no tool which is currently on the world can really do this in an automated fashion. In my opinion, a compliance tool chain should also be fully open source. There should be, of course, no need for a commercial vendor, because every company is obliged to do that because of Copyright Act. And we have a huge supply chain, and my dream is that I receive compliance artifacts from our suppliers in a way that I simply can pass it through our customers.
Okay. And John.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would like to kind of like continue with the same theme there, that so I have to say that I have the benefit that I stand on the shoulders of giants. So there were people before me that actually created already our compliance program, and we have had compliance programs for a very long time. From the Nokia Networks part of view, we have had a compliance process and program already since 2004. And we have been using open source for a very long time. But our pain points are most probably still the same that everybody else has. And coming back to that, what Oliver said, that our tools are not that good. And I can say that with good conscience, because we built our own tools. We built them early on. And a tool that has been built by somebody for doing a little thing called open source in 2004 in when every single product has open source in it in 2019 isn't necessarily the best tool in the world anymore. In addition, how we do software has changed from very much a waterflow model to CI/CD, and if I would get the old expression, if I would get €1 every time that somebody would yell at me that our tools are really, really bad, I would be a rich man. And the thing is also that I agree with Oliver that we should actually look at industry level solutions to this and looking at basically, because that would not only help everybody to use open source, help everybody to be compliant in the right way, because that's also what we want, is to be compliant. We get something from the open source communities, the least that we could do is to be compliant with the licenses on those. But also that it would nicely codify that what does the compliance mean? So if everybody's compliant in the same way, that must be the right way of being compliant as well.
Exactly. So there are tools on the market today, whether open source or proprietary, and there's also initiatives such as OpenChain that are looking at this. How do you see those two coming together? Do you see tools like Fossology, or I know we have people from FossID and other tools like that here with us today. How do you see them coming together? Are people starting to recognize that compliance is this issue still that's in some ways constraining industry around open source? Well, I know that my friend Carsten thinks that compliance is simple. But I'm much more aligned with Olivier. It takes a huge amount of workload, and maybe there are kind of AI technologies that can help us with this, but it's not going to help us completely. Integration in CI/CD is a big issue. It's going to increase the speed around which we need to do compliance. We expect more and more reactivity from our developers and quicker releases, but that of course then means we need more reactivity around the compliance process. So how do you see this coming together?
So from we co-maintain Fossology and we also maintain Software 360. And we are also engaged with FossID and all the other vendors. So in my opinion, still there is room for the commercial vendors, but at least the interfaces in order to connect to their tools should be implemented as an open source project. Otherwise, there is no chance anymore, because we have, I think at Siemens we have tons of different build tool chains, and saying, oh, we have a connector to Jenkins, does not help us out of the problem. So we need connectors to all those tools.
Okay. Carsten.
Yeah, I should say anything. Something. So I didn't say that creating compliance is simple. I said that we know that what we have to do. In the past, we discussed licenses and what they mean. This is a phase which is gone. We know what we have to do. The problem is the mess of the software and how often we have to do the same thing. And indeed, we do not have the tools which allow us to automate the complete chain. And I want to emphasize another aspect of the open source compliance. Why do I love the topic open source compliance? Others love to code. I love compliance. Why? Without open source licenses, we do not have any open source software. Only the licenses allow us to cooperate. If we create a piece of software, and if we license this software on any open source license, we can cooperate based on this license. There is no need to make another contract. It is very simple. And this is the base of our business in the future. And therefore, it is important that we take the compliance as a topic seriously.
Agreed. Well, thank you. Next
Great,
question.
thanks. That's a topic of compliance. Is there any question on this topic of compliance from the audience? Please, by all means. And you need a microphone. It has to be a short question, Marcel. We agree it's a short question, yes.
He knows me too long. The point is, you agree basically all of this kind of companies to that a little bit of mess in open source. Wouldn't it be time to have one general standard for components and reuse of open source, which could really fulfill this kind of Lego idea? And couldn't you be the consortia, as telecom massive companies, to establish something like that for us?
Good question. So we are currently working with other interested companies in an open source project which is called Sharing Creates Value, which is about the open source compliance toolchain, or to build up the open source compliance toolchain. So this is one open source project we are working on. There's also another initiative going on, which is called ACT, the Automated Compliance Tooling, I think from the Linux Foundation. And we have also OSCAR, this project from the Eclipse Foundation. So you see, there are these initiatives popping up. What me concerns personally a little bit is already this fragmentation. Yeah. In my opinion, we need an umbrella organization which really, let's say, works together with all those initiatives in order to avoid fragmentation and double work.
Okay, great. Carsten.
Yes, let me add a quick short aspect
answer, yeah.
and very quick. A clear answer to the question whether Deutsche Telekom and, for example, Siemens can build, set up and dictate the solution. No. The solution has to be adapted by the community. We can only support the community, and if we are in a phase where distribute different solutions, we have to go through these phases.
Community, bottom up, it has to be bottom up.
Roberto.
Thank you. Roberto, one question.
Okay, so
Quick.
thanks a lot for your presentation, really fascinating, I think. A question and a remark, very quickly. The key to solving this compliance issue, I think has been said many times, is get into an agreement on a standard on how to create and manipulate these compliance documents. One starting point, which is very important, is to all agree on the reference data set of the source code on top of which we extract our compliance information. As some of you know, I'm leading a project whose name is Software Heritage. We are building a new universal archive of all the source code around the world. Our goal is not to do compliance. We are not a company, we are a foundation, but we are providing a base that you can use with standardized identifiers, everything needed to build on top of it. I have heard your remark about your complaint about the fact that Europe is not so much present. I mean, you want to raise this net. Well, I would suggest you to have a look at what we do. Software Heritage is an international organization, but it is built in Europe, based in France, and I have to say, up to now, I see a lot of American and Chinese partners with us, not a single European one in this vendor space. So, yes, you can complain, but I think you should act.
Thank you. Oh, without a question.
So, call to action to Europe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. I could add something, but we'll refrain and move on to the next topic of this roundtable, which is so compliance is where you come from naturally, because it's all about risk and making sure you avoid any litigation and using open software the wrong way and mixing it the wrong way. And of course, I understand from a traditional commercial perspective, this free thing is something that is very counterintuitive, and you really have to be prepared. Now, another issue that may be counterintuitive is to use the software, but to make sure that you don't kill the goose with the golden eggs, and you make sure that it keeps providing software, but it can only keep providing software if you contribute back and if you make sure that the source keeps alive. So how do you proceed? Are there any governance tactics? What can be the best practices to make sure to make people understand, the management understand that it's not only legal piracy that to use the software, but you really have to contribute and make it and build it. At some point, it will cost something. Jona.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, very good question. This is something that we think about almost every day. The first thing is that I think that first, when we started to use open source, we came with this moral question: are we just exploiting this, or is it okay that we just use it, or should we contribute as well? And we came to the conclusion, yes, you have to contribute as well, of course, and that's the right thing to do in the kind of from moral perspective. But actually that what I said also a little bit in my presentation, I think that when you think about it further and you use a lot more of open source, you notice that there is always little things to fix. And if you take the code yourself and you fix it just for yourself, you're not actually kind of like being exploiting, you're just being stupid, because what you actually do is you fork from the upstream, and you think that you're creating something that is beneficial for yourself, but you are actually hurting yourself. And this is something that what we have been basically making people understand inside the company, that if you fork, you're in trouble. And like I said, we had an example where we used FreeBSD. We forked it and did a lot of cool things in the networking stack back in 1998. That was our differentiation. We were really good. It was a really good stack, and we were building products on that. Then came multi-core processors, and the FreeBSD from 1998 did not do symmetric multiprocessing at all. So we were all of a sudden in front of a dilemma where we had all this differentiation, which was not that positively differentiating anymore anyways, because actually the community had gotten in ahead of us even on those features, but also our software just didn't do that what the open source software did. And you could not just say, well, we'll take the open source software and start again. That meant we had to rewrite the software or the whole product again. So if you don't contribute back, what you're actually doing is you're hurting just yourself. So it's actually in your benefit to always contribute back. It's not just moral right. And one small thing as well is the compliance. You need some compliance also to contribute. You have to understand what license it is and what you're giving out while you're doing that. And what is the job of the compliance team is to make sure that you do contribution responsibly, but stay out of the way of the contributors. And this is something that we learned as well. You cannot check every contribution. There's no way of doing that. You will just hurt the contributor. Make sure that you have a different way of making sure that you do contribution responsibly.
Thank you. I think Oliver wants to say, and then Konrad as a systems integrator contributing back.
Yeah,
Oliver.
We love contributions back to the community. We also have a company-wide template process in order to do that. The problem is the Copyright Act, because at least in Germany, in the Copyright Act, it's written that the commercial rights in software developed by a software developer as part of his duties are automatically transferred to the employer. So the only person who really can license the software on an open source license written in a company context is a representative of the senior management. And this is sometimes a hurdle, because it involves a lot of stakeholders, and especially if we are facing projects which require CLAs to be signed. This is a nightmare for a company, to be really honest. But we have also some other, let's say, exceptions of this process, which is based on a trust basis. We do have developers who really contribute to the Linux kernel on their daily basis, they have at least some exceptions for contributions and not to pass the entire big process.
It's extremely important to really understand that contribution matters, but it's, from my perspective, just the beginning of a problem. Because if we contribute, then it's great, but someone needs to accept those contributions into the core product to have it alive. Simply, if you contribute, but your contribution is ignored, and the platform, software, whatever, goes in different direction, then actually the problem you had is the very same, just for a different reason. So it brings us to governance of the open source projects. When, just to give a concrete sample, the governance of Kubernetes by Google versus approach to contribute by IBM and Red Hat. Now the same company, but completely different approaches. One of them very successful. Okay, one of them succeeds more or less. Another one fails miserably. So it's about governance of those projects, how to build not only how to build ecosystem around it.
I think this is really an important point, and I think it was Gunnar that mentioned that doing good open source or doing great open source is kind of about persistence. And I really like that term because it touched a nerve where, you know, you have project teams who are going to say, I'm going to do open source and there's my project and I've put the code out on GitHub or wherever. And then they go, right, now I move on to the next project. And it's kind of the wrong mentality. They need to think about, okay, but putting it out there is the start of the journey. It's not the end of the journey. And this is something we see too often, that companies or projects are putting code out there. They're saying, okay, I'm contributing back to the open source community. There's my code. And then they kind of forget about it. So I think the point you raised there is, how do you then manage the life cycle after the release, getting back the contributions, having an engaged community? I think these are critically important questions which industry still struggles with, and it's not in the business model of industry generally to look at that question.
I just want to add on that, because I think the same thing applies on our consumption internally, because when we consume these sheer amounts of open source, that becomes like a black box for us. And of course, the way to know, we need to know the code, and the best way to know the code is to take part in these communities, do the upstream activities up front, and that means also that black box becomes at least grayish, and then we also can act on whatever support issues we need on it.
Trying to reduce the technical debt.
I think the major point which is still to be learned by some managers is that an open source project is nothing else than a software development project. Yeah? You need the budget, you need the manpower, and you need the marketing. So it's a product introduction, and thinking, oh, I put this code into the public and it evolves like I want to have it. This is totally wrong. You need to have the budget available to maintain the project. Yeah? The only difference to a normal internal product or software project is that everything is done in the public. That's the only difference, but at least you need the budget.
Exactly.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, so in our process, so kind of like two things. So sharing here in open source fashion a little bit our process. So first of all, to Olivia, so we have kind of like looked at the way of that who has the right to contribute is that we have a process that has been approved by our CLOs or our chief legal officer. And we go through that process. Not every, and by the way, we don't actually look at every contribution. What we look at is that we give a right to contribute to a certain area, to a project or part of a project or to a technology. And as it's done within the process, that gives the management okay to that. The people who have the right to do this can do that. And they can, and the idea is really that the product line really does it themselves rather than anybody looking over their shoulder. And the thing is that when we have things that we look at in this process, we look at the legal aspects. So what is the CLA? What is the license? We look at IPR aspects. We have a successful IPR licensing business, which we don't want to risk. And we look at a business aspect. And I have to now, just among friends here, say that the business aspect is more is the person who wants to contribute, are they sane? Or are they crazy? And then one of the checks there is really that, is this fire and forget? And if it's somebody who says like, I have this great code, my research kind of project, or my product is coming to end, we have this great code, I just want to dump it out. That's where we usually say, no, that's not the right thing to do. We want to look at that you actually have the resources to keep that alive. And then we go also other things like, are you sure there's a need for a new project in the world or not?
Yeah, I think it's actually a journey. It's not contribute and disappear. It's a journey, because actually when you contribute to code, you have to learn how the community works. You have to understand who is important, and you have to gradually learn and merge into that, and it's a long-term investment. Yeah, and this, for sure, the North American organizations that you were mentioning are probably, because open source being an avatar of the North American industry, software industry, they are much more powerful than they are here in Europe, and you naturally tend to look at them because they have some more firing power. That's for sure. But another thing, compliance. So compliance is an investment, and contributing back is an investment, and it means in time. The other thing is, open source software is not free. So as you all here are ahead of your open source strategy, open source thinking, you're the open source thinkers of your own large organizations. Can you just share with us some of the arguments or the what you had back in terms of is open source free, or why you would have to spend money on open source? And also there's this question of support, because we talk a lot about the community, but for me the community is only one part of this open source story. There are many companies out there that provide actually for fee support. So do you work with them? Is it a commercial ecosystem that you consider, something you have to sell internally? How do you engage with these people? Gunnar?
Yeah, I think we do all of those and many more. I think that for sure, we take use of companies in different ways. As I mentioned, I mean, we acquire or we source Linux from the likes of Red Hat or Wind River or those kind of companies. We take use of different open source companies that actually do open source in a specific project also, as professional services, basically. And that's very much because they happen to have that knowledge and they have that channel into those communities. So then I think we have a history of seeing open source as just free and no cost whatsoever, and the cost for open source have a tendency to be hidden in the projects, because I mean, someone selects that open source piece, puts that into that during that project, and then that's released. And the cost of compliance and the cost of integration and verification and lifecycle management of that component never really surfaces as a separate cost item somewhere. So I think we are still a bit in the dark when it comes to how much do actually open source cost us as a full R&D machine in that sense. We are starting to get the light on that partly, but far from complete.
I saw Carsten and Oliver smile at your comments. So,
I agree that let's say the total number of investment regarding money in open source is I cannot say it, because I do have at least a feeling of the compliance costs at Siemens. But the contribution effort, since it's done in the units, I do not really can say anything about that. The only thing which I can say is that the old sentence, which is you have to pay either cash or code. So and today I would say, and in future you have to pay cash and code.
yeah. I think what you guys are raising here is one of the comments that it kind of harks back to what I said at the beginning, is that open source is not easy and it's not evident, and it changes the way of thinking. And I think that change of thinking, that culture of thinking within businesses is still not complete. I think we've only kind of started the journey. The costs are hidden. You don't know how much your company is investing in open source because, you know, it's being done by so many developers in so many different ways. And I think these are key messages, and they kind of ring a bell for me. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I think we're going to open the questions to the floor.
So we need, yes. Oh, you've already asked a question, Marcel.
We're going to try Gilles here.
Nice try.
I just wanted to make a comment on open sourcing code. First, by starting by saying, you know, if you're not contributing but you're just forking, you're basically creating your own vendor lock-in, which you don't want when you use open source. But more importantly, when you're contributing your own code out there and you push it out there, one thing nobody's mentioned is that it's not because it's out there that people are going to want to contribute. And sometimes you end up with a GitHub repository that has 3 contributors, all from the same company, your company, and nobody else. So keep in mind that when you're open sourcing your code, it doesn't mean other people will be interested in contributing to it.
Yeah, if I may quickly on this. So you're absolutely right, and this is something that people think that there is some magic to open source. Once you make something public, they will come. That will not happen. There are also things that you might want to look at to make it more positive for people to come. And one thing that I was actually wanted to comment what Oliver said about CLAs. We haven't really seen that problem with CLAs that you have, but what we see a problem is kind of when you have an exotic CLA, which says that, by the way, you give all your rights to me rather than to the open source community, and plus we want these and these patent rights from you as well. And that's when you go like, well, no, we won't really want to be involved in those kind of things. And so if you want your open source kind of like a community to be successful, you really have to look at the governance. You have to look at the licenses, that they are fair for people who also to contribute to those, that they are not that you are just trying to get something from the contributors to yourself.
Thank you. Maybe one, and we have time for one more question.
Okay, hey, Valtteri Halla, Code Scoop. European software and open source in Europe and leadership. So I think you guys there, you are very much the leadership of the open source in Europe. And it was pointed out many times that where is Europe in these charts and everything. Oliver was showing that. And I'm pretty sure that in Europe we don't lack any of the brain power or the capacity. We have so many developers here and so on. But what's the problem really? Like, how do you guys see this? What is the bottleneck, and what can we all do to change this?
In my opinion, it's a matter of culture change. Huh? So the big companies are still in a phase where they are on this journey of culture change. Yeah? And we have some nice developments inside the company that there are several units which say, okay, upstream first, and then we took it from the vanilla project. But you still have to convince the senior management that this is the only way to survive, to be open, to be collaborative, and there are enough possibilities to generate new revenue streams. So it's still a way of culture change, in my opinion.
It is culture, but it's not about continents, it's not about even countries, it's about local ecosystems. That, for example, West Coast innovation ecosystem in US is completely different than East Coast. And if you check the statistics, who contributes the most, West Coast would be on top, East Coast would be behind Europe. Okay, at least some places in Europe. So it's again building a community about building ecosystem with proper funding, I believe, and maybe the last thing is where Europe lags behind regarding VCs, for example, but Horizon 2020 is actually a huge opportunity. So we are simply different. It's not working the same way as in some key regions, key global regions, but what we are building here starts to matter. I strongly believe that.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that as well. Orange, as I said, Orange is hugely active within the open source communities. And if you look at, for example, the ONAP initiative through the Linux Foundation, Orange is one of the key players within that. So I think it's a question of this culture change is happening, but it's not natural, it's not easy. And I think there is this difference of funding, which would enable more projects to go out there, take the risk, engage with communities and see how the business develops. I think there's still also a certain risk aversion that we have within Europe when you compare to the US or maybe to certain Chinese or Asian countries. But I think I agree with you, we have the expertise, that's not in question.